Welcome to Rick on Life, brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Media Project. I'm your host, Rick Amitin, and this is where we love to talk about things that affect our daily lives. Today, we're going to be talking about faith in the 21st century. I'm also joined today by the lovely and talented Tammy Dempsey. Tammy is a person of deep spiritual passion. She's an author and a speaker. And Tammy has spent years dealing with her own BS, also known as belief system, and recognizing the pain of believing in things that aren't accurate. Tammy is also a friend, and we've known each other for over 40 years. It's my pleasure to have her on the show. Tammy, welcome to Rick on Life.
Thank you. I started to say it's a pleasure to be here, but I don't know yet.
How you doing today?
Hey, I am wonderfully well and blessed and highly favored of the Lord. Just got the chaos settled down around me, so taking a few deep breaths.
Well, you're doing better than some of us then if you've got the chaos around you all settled down. Listen, before we dive into this subject, I thought it would be good to introduce one of my favorite quotes, which I think is very good for our topic today. But I love this. It's a quote from Reba McEntire. Reba says, to succeed in life, you need three things. You need a wishbone, a backbone, and a funny bone. And I think that is so applicable to just so much of our life, especially with a subject like this. Faith in the 21st century. For some, faith is the cornerstone of their life. For others, faith is not only frowned on, but ridiculed. Activists on both sides of the issue would like the privilege of having the final say on the matter. Both sides present their arguments with obviously self-satisfied convincement. Some believe in God in spite of mysteries, controversies, and unanswered questions, while others seem very happy to dismiss the very notion of God as superstition, fallacy, and utterly lacking in intellect and reason for even the smallest infraction. This long-standing debate is nothing new. It appears to be woven into the fabric of humanity. What motivates us to believe or not believe seems to be more diverse than any other aspect of our lives. Some would say that the road to peace is to do away with all notions of God, or at least religious practice. And yet others see the pursuit of God as the only path to the promised land. Whereas compromise is the perfect solution for many disputes, it appears to be an unlikely suitor for bridging the gaps between believers and non-believers. My experience with all extremists is that they have decided against any further exploration. My compassion lies with the people who are caught in the crossfires of ideology, who would like a safe place to investigate, understand, and decide for themselves without the pressure to conform one way or the other because it's what's expected or demanded by someone or some group. I see the discussion, or the decision rather, about faith as perhaps the most important decision that we individually must make. Tammy, jump in here. Give me your thoughts on these opening comments.
I think first, I totally agree with what you're saying. I have to wonder how we're defining faith.
Well, good.
It
Let's
is
jump in.
something.
Go ahead.
It is something that, because if I talk about faith and somebody else is defining it differently, it could not be understood as I'm speaking it. For me, faith is believing that God exists and that he shows up for those that are looking for him. So as a person of faith, I believe God is, that he exists, and that I'm always looking for him in every circumstance, situation. I'm expecting him to show up for me, that I am not alone. I have a heavenly Father that is always there, ever present, to protect, help. He's my more than enough. So my faith is that I believe in God and that he is there for me.
Let's break that down a little bit. And when we talk about defining faith, I think there's a couple of definitions that might make it a little easier to kind of discuss the idea here of faith. One definition is that faith is complete trust and confidence in someone or something. A second definition of faith is that faith is a strong belief in God or in religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. And a third definition of faith might be that it is inner peace in God or in religion, it is inner peace based on understanding of facts and fiction. And so faith is obviously something that's very personal, but I also think that, and while many people would have something to say in terms of how they define faith, but I think from a general perspective, I think when we're talking about faith, it's easily attached to this belief in God, this belief in a higher power, this belief in, a heavenly Father. It could be a belief in love, unconditional love. It could be, a belief in something beyond yourself. But I don't think necessarily faith is as mystical as some people would make it out to be. For instance, I think faith gets used every day, even for people who maybe don't even claim to be religious. For instance, if I was going to board a plane, I would do so only with the faith that I was going to arrive safely on the other end. If I truly believed I would not arrive safely, or that plane was going to drop from the sky, or that even it was going to be blown out of the air. If I felt that, believed that, possessed that, I most likely, if I was in control of my reason and my faculties, I wouldn't get on that plane. But the fact that we just get on it, and because we do believe that we're going to arrive safely on the other end, that is an exercise of faith. And so I think people are separating somehow faith as into a particular category that somehow is different than how we live our lives every day. It's like we don't get into the car believing that we're going to be in an automobile accident. And, we could just continue to use those examples. But faith, I think, is just the ability to believe. We believe in something. We trust in something. We trust in someone. And so some people will take faith the other direction, away from God. They trust in themselves. They trust in their intellect. They trust in their um, their education. They trust in their skill set. I mean, we can trust and have faith in all kinds of things. And so I think faith in itself isn't really up for debate. I think the debate happens when we want to attach it to God.
There you go.
And there's where we have somehow this line then that wants to divide everyone. Your thought there?
Well, it's true. I mean, we drive through green lights believing that the people on the other side's going to stop. You know, the faith is in operation. We wouldn't get married if we didn't have faith. Just all of our decisions that we make based on believing something, having confidence in something, trust in something.
Trust. So since we have this line when it comes to faith, and people can accept faith on many levels, but then there's a certain number of people who will struggle or stagger, stumble, resist, outright refuse faith when it comes to God, to having faith in God. So I think maybe when we talk about religion and spirituality, we may actually be talking about something a little bit different. And it's very, very popular today for people to claim to be spiritual without being religious. And that doesn't bother me. I don't think it's any less effective or any less viable because it's popular. But what exactly would they be referring to? Because I'm one of those people who now believes that for much of my life I had been religious and not nearly as spiritual as I would have or I thought myself to be. And now I'm certainly much less religious, and by my own estimation, much more spiritual. So when you approach religion and you approach spirituality, I think for me, there's so many ways to define it. I mean, you know, religion has its limitations, whereas I think God is unlimited. I think religion has its it has its approach that can be very, very singular, where I think God is much more broad. I also think that religion is, one way to look at it is, I think that religion can be man's attempt to explain God, whereas I think spirituality can be or is God's God explaining himself. When you approach religion and spirituality, and I know from our friendship over the years and conversations, you would also think that there is a difference there. What are your thoughts on that?
For me, religion is about a set of beliefs in a box. This is who God is. This is a way. This is right. And usually, each religion is right. So, like you said, there is. I don't know, I think I lost you, but I'll keep talking. There you are. For me, religion was, I was following a very strict set of rules for acceptance. And spirituality for me is, I believe that God is truth, and I am seeking after truth. It doesn't matter where I find it or what it's disguised as. I'm looking for truth, and I am on a journey. I want to know truth, a hunger for truth. And I'm not going to get stuck in a box. And I feel like religion is a box. Religions, they all have something awesome, some belief in it, some part of it that is beautiful. And I can say, yes, that's God. And it's like then they've taken this beautiful revelation that somebody got and built a dogma or a doctrine around that. There's that story of the 4 or 5 blind men that come up on an elephant, and one's touching the side of the elephant and says, oh, I know what an elephant is. An elephant's like a wall. And one's touching the tail and said, no, an elephant's like a rope. And one's touching the ear, says, an elephant's like a sail. One's touching the leg and said, no, an elephant's like a tree. Well, they're all right. But they're just seeing a portion of what an elephant is. And that's the way I feel about religion. They find some piece of God, and they describe that and build a doctrine around it. So for me, that's the difference. Spirituality for me is I am connecting with God on a daily, moment by moment basis, and I am searching for truth. I want to know who He is in all of His entirety.
Yeah, I think
It's
experientially, I think when you get involved in religion and religion becomes a practice, you can become so involved in the rules, the regulations, the tenets of those particular sets of ideas and beliefs, that you become so focused on them that because of our human tendency to want to be right and correct and all of that, I think it's very easy to lose track of that the purpose of those things to begin with is to stay focused, on God, not the rules. Doesn't mean that we don't learn certain principles and apply things because we have discovered them as principles. But the principles, to me, are never going to be more important than the relationship with God to begin with. And so there's where I think that even something that starts out very beautiful, a relationship with God, and is very powerful, can be hijacked. We can lose sight of that beauty because we then start defining it in our own terms or in our limited understanding of those terms. So where does faith, a question that I ponder quite a bit is, I have faith, you have faith, I think everybody has faith. I do apply my faith to the realm of spirituality and God and the idea of God. But where does it come from? Where do we get this faith that we have, that we structure our life on, that we build our life around? Where does it really come from? Well, I think when we first begin our understanding of faith or things of faith, about things of faith, I think many of us get it from our family, from our early childhood, where we were instructed, taught, made aware of, were exposed to a way of thinking and believing. So I think family certainly in many people's lives plays a big part of that. I do think that there are also many people who didn't have that in their childhood, but later on in life, through their experiences and the things that they encountered, the questions that formed in their minds, their pursuit of learning and trying to make meaning and purpose and all of that out of life, I think they come to a place of faith. But I also think because of how faith just exists, that it's innate. I think we are born with the capacity to believe. And I think then we make decisions about what we're going to believe. But I think the ability to believe, which I would describe certainly as a part of faith, I think is innate. I think we're born with it. Now, you and I have different experiences in our upbringing, but we ended up for many years in the same belief system, in the same religion, and experienced some of the, the very same things, even though we had a very different journey to get there, and both of us have experienced a different components and some similar components as we continue to journey on in our faith. So talk to me about how you felt like your faith came to you and originally, and then how that faith has been, how you have used that faith to move on.
Well, my belief is that I'm getting really tickled here because my screen is just covered with flies. So if you see, anyway.
We do. I do see it. Yeah.
I'm like, the chaos. Okay, peace. Serenity now. My experience, from my experience, I believe, like you said, that we're born, it's innate. But I would even take it a little bit further, is that when we are young, very young, we remember where we came from. And my experience, I had a unique experience. When I was born, I'd wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, which was my dad's prayer time. He'd change my diaper, make me a bottle, wrap me up like papoose, and take me down. We lived 2 doors down from the church. He would lay me on the altar and feed me a bottle while he prayed. I'd go back to sleep to him praying. I'd wake up again about 9 o'clock in the morning, my mom's prayer time. She'd change my diaper, feed me, make a bottle, put me on the bed where she knelt and feed me a bottle while she prayed. So I'd go back to sleep to the sound of my mom praying. Within 2 weeks or so, I would not go to sleep unless someone was praying. They actually would have to leave the room and pray to get me to go to sleep. This was my life. 2 years old, I prayed miracles. There was just a belief. I had a belief that all I had to do was ask, and it would happen. So I can remember having a connection with my Papa God, and which is strange because in church, the God that was preached from the pulpit was actually, I never assumed that those two were one. It was totally different. But I had faith that I was loved, and whatever I needed, I could have. And that was kind of, I don't want to blame anybody, but that was kind of taught out of me, I could say, or not that they taught me, but I caught what I caught and experienced. It got me away from that. And I didn't remember it till later in my life. But what I have noticed as I have, because that's become a conscious thing in me, I have noticed that little kids are very much still connected and with a knowing. They just have that knowing. They trust the parents. The parents can throw them in the air. The parents can, they have this knowing and this trust that everything is going to be okay. That I'm taken care of. I'm being well provided. Life may, knock it out of them, but they come into this life knowing that connection.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the statement. I forget at the moment who made it, but maybe our listeners will identify with it or remember who the author is. But the statement was made that we're all born geniuses, and life has a way of de-geniusing us and taking that genius out of us. Now, playing devil's advocate for a minute, people on the other side of this faith discussion would say that even if they gave us the premise that children were born feeling a connection, feeling, if things were right in their home and with their parents, and they felt loved and they felt secure and they felt they didn't have questions of lack or insecurity or feeling like they weren't going to have what they needed, if things were just good and they had that religion then is what began to introduce to them doubts, shame, guilt, condemnation. And so, that might be their argument. And it is certainly in some circles that is their argument. But if faith is innate in us and we do come with that, I think the introduction of human beings into our lives, by nature of our humanity, introduces some things that are less than perfect, less than desirable, less than wholesome, less than, we could go on and on and on there. I didn't begin the same way that you did, but I did reach a point early on in my childhood that I too felt that love, felt that connection, felt just that, things would work out, but then I had to endure a lot of things that altered that and changed those feelings of security, those feelings of being loved unconditionally, those ideas that, I could expect good things to come out of life. Things began to change. And when those feelings changed, those thoughts changed, I began to act according to those ways of thinking and feeling, which then added layers of complications to me that I had to then try to later on unravel. They became emotional knots and intellectual knots and religious knots and all of that had to be unraveled. Whereas in your case, you didn't have the same difficulties by going out into the world and doing all kinds of nutty things that adds complications to people's lives. But you had your own set of complications.
Absolutely.
So as you these things begin to happen to you, and you felt like this was, you were, by experience and observation, you lost your grip on what seemed so virtuous and pure and good and healthy. So share how you moved on. What did you do in your arena?
So in my arena, let's see, when I was 12, my dad was a traveling evangelist, and our family traveled, and he was preaching somewhere, and a prophet, famous prophet, had come to his meeting. And at some point towards the end, this prophet came down into the audience, and I was sitting next to my mom. My mom was on the aisle, and he stood over me and said, "Young lady, you are a disgrace to your father and to his ministry." My mom stood up like between us, like she was going to protect me. But that was a shock to my system. I had no idea what he was talking about or why. That totally, that triggered a chain of events, but that totally changed my life, because it introduced shame at such a huge, a spiritual level. That being a disgrace to my father and his ministry, that was a spiritual shame. And I became a goody two-shoes trying to overcome that. Did everything that would please my father, walking in his footsteps and honoring him every way I could. Which caused me to, a lot of the questions that I had about what I would hear at church versus my Papa God that I was used to in my private time. I learned, not that I was taught, but I learned that it wasn't okay to have those kind of thoughts or those kind of questions, and that I needed to just assimilate into what everybody else thought and believed. And I became, that's when my false self, I became somebody else. I veered away from who I was truly to this false self that was acceptable and would get the pats on the hands and the praise. And then I got cancer.
Hold on just a minute before we go there, because this experience is what is the very thing that is often used by people who have such a difficulty with the whole concept of God. And it is this authoritative, tyrannical abuse that happens when people start taking this assumed power that's unauthorized, but gets used all the time because of the claiming of a title or a position, and they begin to exercise control and rule over other people. And I mean, we can, you could talk about that experience at the, now, what, 50 years later? And you can relate, looking back, how you felt at that point and how you would never tolerate something like that now. But the point that I want to really get to is the fact that this happened to you, and it did alter the way that you felt as a 12-year-old child. It altered your view of how you were looking at spiritual things. The trappings and the confines of your religious upbringing, and you over time certainly knew that you needed to move away from that. But whereas some people then throw in the towel and say, because that exists, It's all invalid. Let's get rid of all of it. We just need to get that kind of thinking, because they will take that and show that so many wars in our world have been these religious wars where people are assuming authority in this area and need to dominate some other group, could even be another religious group. And these holy wars take place because somebody feeling superior and become tyrannical about it, authoritarians, and then they completely feel it necessary to dominate any and everything. But you somehow were able to move from that, move away from those barriers that were not legitimate, but you did not throw God out with the experience. That's, I think, is extremely important.
You know, my knowledge of God was experiential. So I could not deny, that's what I said, my upbringing was unique in that, whereas a lot of kids forget that true connection with a Papa God type thing, it was very much alive in me. I knew I had, I just witnessed so much. So he was always there for me. There for me, even up into seconds before we started recording this, my internet totally went down and they said they couldn't help me till tomorrow. And then this morning somebody calls and says, is there any chance I can help you this morning? Hallelujah. That's my expectation. I didn't say anything because I had an expectation, a knowing that he would the internet would work fine, or he was going to work it out somehow. It wasn't my job. I put it on his to-do list, and I just rested in peace. That has been experiential for me, regardless of what man has done and how man has acted. I've had that connection with God. So that's how I've been able to maintain my faith, my belief, my knowing, my confidence that I am loved.
Well, how would you respond today to people, to some man in a position, a title, whether he's considered a prophet, a preacher, whatever the case, whether he is just a guru, how would you respond today with somebody attempting to shame you or control you by fear or what else, whatever else?
It just wouldn't happen. In other words, there are these controlling and tyrannical people in ministry or whatever, but they couldn't do it unless people were there surrendering their power to them. They wouldn't have anything to control. And I just don't surrender my power anymore to anybody.
No, I understand that, but at 12 years old, you weren't in possession of that understanding. And there are a lot of people, even much older than that, who might find themselves in these situations where either fear, shame, or some other very strong negative would be used to want to control thought, behavior, or whatever else. And so I'm really trying to make the connection here between, that was a long time ago, and I understand that you were just a child when it happened, but I know that you have worked that back in your experience. And while you could say that would just never happen today, I would never tolerate that. I know better than that. I wouldn't put up with that. But then you have you have these people who are willing to get rid of all of that because they're not going to, if that represents God in any form or fashion, they don't want it. And yet they also believe that it's illegitimate, that is not how God, if he even existed, would operate. And if he was, there's something that's completely wrong with, because it goes from here to much bigger things. Like, how could a loving God allow so many hurtful and harmful and bad things, much worse things, murder, genocide, millions of people being murdered and killed, and children. I mean, it gets to be a much bigger conversation. And so I'm really interested in the process of how you moved on from such a young and yet very negatively impactful experience to seeing that beyond all of that, as the activities of man and what man can do when he decides to take God in his own hands, and understand that differently than what you believe and understand God to be now.
Well, my journey, I had cancer, found out I had cancer. And there was a month between the diagnosis and the prognosis. So for a month, I didn't know whether I was going to live or die. I didn't know how bad it was. And I was emotionally paralyzed, but I had a lot of time to think. I couldn't do anything. But I had a lot of time to think. And one of the recurring thoughts was, what will people say at my funeral? If I die, what are people going to say? And I realized that they would say everything that I had led them to believe. But they didn't know that I was in emotional and physical pain every day of my life. They didn't know that I had been bulimic since I was 14 years old. They didn't know a lot about me. And so it caused me to question this. This grief came over me so deep that if I die and nobody really knew me, did I ever really live? And it just kept playing. If I die and nobody really knows me, did I ever really live? And what would have been the point? So my commitment was that if I live, I am going to live honest and transparent. I'm going to be real. No more pretending. And that that started my journey with just having to be real and finding a safe place to be real, and wanting to, setting myself free to explore and ask the questions, even if it was just to myself, that I had stifled. And mainly, of course, about people's behavior in church, in ministry, stories, the illustrations that they would use to get a message across, illustrations that would just kick me in the gut. And it seemed like everybody else around me was like, yeah, this is great, and even tell it and repeat it the next day. So it set me on a journey looking for truth inside myself, the truth of who God is, the truth to be real, and learning. The next step was we started teaching in the church about boundaries, the book by Dr. Henry Cloud. And at the same time, I was going to Life Skills by Paul Hegstrom, author of Angry Men and the Women That Love Them. And in that process, through boundaries and domestic violence, that was taking these to help the people in the church so that I could help, and discovered in the process that I was abusive and controlling. Biggest hit of my life.
So I appreciate the admission. I certainly have plenty of them to make too, because, you do somewhat become a product of your environment. And we are affected by the things that are around us, and the thought processes that we go through. And, there again, we're just introducing our subject, and I hope to talk about this for the next few shows. But, there are people who look at the whole journey of what we're going through, what we have gone through, and where we have arrived, and they're very willing to just say, all of that is ridiculous. You can just avoid all of that nonsense by getting away from the whole notion of God, this whole church thing, this whole religious thing. This is, just all guilt and shame, and it's all fantasy, and it's unprovable, and there's no. So there's a lot here to talk about. So I'm glad that we began the conversation today, and I'm very eager and willing and looking forward to continue to, talk about faith in the 21st century. But Tammy, I want to thank you for being with us today, sharing the show with me and sharing your experience. And I'm looking forward to having you for the next few shows. But let me end on this note. I think many things appear to be changing in our world. And in reality, it might just be history repeating itself, because movements rise and fall, ideologies get tested, philosophies get constructed and destructed every day, governments come and go. Is there anything really new under the sun? What is it that we could hold on to that won't fail us in the end? Maybe the debate is less controversial than it appears. What if the argument isn't really about faith versus reason? What if it's more transparently about those who want to know God and those who want to be God? I think it's a sophisticated question, but I also think it has a legitimate answer. And as we begin to explore this, I consider myself a student that stays in a learning mode. I feel like I do have some answers, resolved issues that have brought peace to my life. I don't believe that I know everything, that I have every answer, and it keeps me on the edge of wanting to learn, to understand, to want to know more. I don't want to draw conclusions because of human error and human imperfections. We all have that. So I think it's important to continue to have an open mind and an open heart to look at all aspects of life, and especially when it comes to something so fundamentally important as faith. So remember this: whatever's going on in your life, no matter how difficult and challenging, just sprinkle a little love on it. Thanks for being here today. I'm your host, Rick Amitin, and I'll see you next time.